I would like to welcome to the microphone Conor Clenaghan, my colleague from ECHA, who's going to tell you something about the functions of the ECHA Endocrine Disruption Expert Group, which might or might not have a role to play in this somewhere further down the line. So, Conor, over to you. It's hard.
Okay. Thanks very much, Tim. Okay, so the start of the talk maybe is a little bit of history lesson, just on how these substances got onto the candidate list and what were the considerations, and then bringing you more up to date maybe just on the workings of the ED expert group. So I'll provide a very brief regulatory process overview on the SVHC process, information on the SVHC identification of these phenol substances, and an overview on the ED expert group work. So just for those that may not be so familiar with this, the process starts with the indication of an intention on our Registry of Intentions on the ECHA website, and subsequently the identification of the SVHC or not. And then there's subsequent steps of prioritization of substances on the candidate list for the authorization list. I won't talk about that today, as these substances are already on the authorization list. So in terms of the registry of current SVHC intentions, it's a first step. Member states or ECHA, on the request of the Commission, usually inform interested parties of their intention to identify substances as an SVHC, and this is published on the Registry of Intentions on the ECHA's website. There's no public consultation at that stage. However, there are preceding steps to this. I'll show them later in a later slide when I talk about the expert group. In terms of the identification of the SVHC, then the authority will submit their proposal as an Annex 15 dossier of the identification of the substance SVHC. It's published on the ECHA's website. There's a public consultation for 45 days. And then a decision is taken either by the Member State Committee or the Commission, if there isn't agreement at the Member State Committee stage. And then the candidate list will be updated if the substance is identified as SVHC. And it takes about 5 months for the process, for a typical dossier to go through that process. And as Tim already alluded to, these substances that we're talking about today, the ethoxylates, were added in 2012 and 2013, and the 4-tartoctyl phenol, which was the first substance of this group to be identified, was December 2011, and 4-nonyl phenol in December 2012. In terms of the SVHC identification for these substances, there was 2 aspects covered in the Annex 15 dossiers, and then in the MSc support documents that you will see on the ECHA's website. There's the ED identification part, and then the equivalent level of concern part. In terms of the ED identification, this was based on the WHO IPCS definition, looking at endocrine modes of action, adverse effects, and then biological plausible link between the endocrine mode of action and adverse effects. And then in terms of the equivalent level of concern, you have to show that these substances would be of equivalent concern to CMRs, PBTs, VPVBs, and there can be various aspects you might take into account there, such as severity of the effect of these substances, or long-term effects of these substances, delays in effects of these substances, difficulty to set safe thresholds. These types of issues dossier submitters might bring up in terms of the equivalent level of concern discussion. So moving briefly, I just tried to summarize this quite briefly, given the time we have here, on what were the key considerations for 4-tartoctyl phenol and 4-nonyl phenol. The dossier, the MSc support document, which you'll see, demonstrates that the fish species fit to an estrogenic mode of action. In the fish species, there's a clear link between the endocrine mode of action and adverse effects from high-quality studies. The endocrine-mediated adverse effects in fish are very low concentrations, low X in the low microgram per litre range. And typical adverse effects, the adverse effects seen in 4-octyl-phenol at these levels were impacts on fertility and fecundity, and at 4-nonyl-phenol changes in sex ratio. There's a variety of species, fish species, looked at, and these effects were demonstrated in. And there was also indication of ED effects in invertebrates and amphibians at even lower concentrations in the dossiers, but no definite conclusion was made on these effects owing to the lack of knowledge on the endocrine systems, low quality data, lack of test systems. But just it's important to note that there is some discussion on these other taxa in the documents. In terms of the 4-tert-octyl-phenol ethoxylates and the non-phenol ethoxylates, these ethoxylates degrade to 4-tert-octyl-phenol and 4-nonyl-phenol in the wastewater treatment plants and receiving water bodies, and remain a long-term source of the octyl-phenol and the nonyl-phenol. So sediment and pelagic organisms may be exposed to these substances, resulting from the degradation of the ethoxylates and potentially also remobilization of these substances from sediment if sediment is disturbed. And there's available in vivo and in vitro data that indicates that the short-term ethoxylates are endocrine active in fish. This is at the time now that these dossiers were put together. However, there was no data available on adverse endpoints. So the conclusion was for the ethoxylates that it wasn't possible to conclude whether or not they were EDs. Therefore, the SVHC identification of the ethoxylates was based on their degradation to 4-tert-octyl-phenol and 4-nonyl-phenol. Some important considerations is that the MSE has produced the MSE agreement documents and support documents for each of these substances, publicly available, and the SVHC identification was based on unanimous decisions in all these cases. The MSE support documents themselves state that although there might be a safe level, it's difficult to estimate, and there were various considerations there, such as the wide variety of species potentially affected, which species are the most sensitive. There's appear to be effects on the endpoints not considered in OECD test guidelines. There's long-term delayed effect considerations, potential ED effects, for example, on inverts at very low levels, as I mentioned, and lack of knowledge and test systems for EDs in certain taxa. And also, it's very important to note that the MSE doesn't try to determine safe levels during SVHC identification. So there was no attempt at that stage to make an estimate of threshold. So moving on to the ED expert group. The ED expert group was established on the basis of agreement by the competent authorities for REACH and biocidal products regulation, and the mandate was agreed by these groups back in 2013. It's contributing to the efficient assessment of substances with potential ED properties, with more than 50 substances that have come through the group at this stage, and we believe it's an important step forward in facilitating the implementation of REACH, including the SVHC roadmap aims to get all relevant substances on the candidate list by 2020. And it's also supporting implementation of the biocidal products regulation. The meetings are coordinated and hosted and chaired by ECHA in Helsinki, and we have a lot of member state participation and also a lot of participation from stakeholder organizations. There's 4 DGs involved from the Commission and other organizations. So it's quite a big group, the endocrine expert group. Typically meets 3 times a year if demand requires, depending on the number of substances being brought forward. So there's just some links there for further information on the group. So the group itself is important to take note that it provides informal and non-binding scientific advice on the assessment of ED properties of chemicals. So it considers information and testing needs on substances, data interpretation, screening, development, screening for EDs, potential EDs. ED expert group serves the evaluating agencies. Typically an MSCA will come requesting advice on an assessment that they're putting together, and then that evaluating member state will then decide how to take the deliberations of the expert group into account. So the expert group doesn't take formal decisions, and these decisions remain the responsibility of the competent authorities designated under REACH and biocidal products regulation. Maybe won't say too much about this, just to put the ED expert group work into context. If you look, is there a pointer on this?
Yeah, but it might not reach.
Oh, it might not reach. Okay, sorry. So basically, where the expert group is in the box that starts generation of further information assessment on the right hand side. You can see PBT ED assessment. So that's where it's sitting, in beside substance evaluation, because it's actually primarily substance evaluation that the expert group supports. But it also contributes to, say, development of algorithms for screening the REACH registration data for potential EDs. So it supports substance evaluation. And then it also supports member states if they put together the dossier based on the substance evaluation outcome for potential SVHC identification, and member state might bring a dossier to the group to see if the group considers that they have enough information for potential SVHC identification. So it also comes in at that stage. So the group will help identify if there is a concern with a substance. The evaluating member state will take their advice on board and then complete their assessment. And this often takes the form of risk management option analysis ultimately, where that member state will decide whether to take that substance further into REACH regulatory processes, or to be dealt with under other legislation, or no action at all, for example, if ED wasn't thought to be a concern. So the group has had 8 meetings since February 2014, and the ED expert group discussions are informed by the WHO definition of an ED, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, and also various reports that have come out. For example, the JRC ED Expert Advisory Group report on the identification of EDs and the EFSA opinion. The group very much takes into account the OECD conceptual framework for testing and assessment of EDs and the guidance documents. And the discussions in the group mostly focus on interpretation of available data that the evaluating member state has brought forward, identification of further information requirements, and strategies to fill these identified data gaps, which, as I say, it's primarily supporting substance evaluation work. At least that's how it has played out so far with the group in general. And of course, as you all know, the EDA criteria are being developed at Commission level, and the implication of these, although they're being developed for the biocides and plant protection product regulations, the implication of these for the work of the ED expert group and for REACH need to be further considered by the group. And it's important to note as well that the ED expert group was set up after the SVHC identification of these phenols, so the ED expert group didn't play a role in those processes. So just to conclude, 4-tartoctyl phenol and nonylphenol phenol were identified as EDs based on the WHO definition, and that there's strong evidence from high quality studies of endocrine mediated adverse effects in fish species with low exit, low microgram per litre range. And there's also indication of effects in other taxa that may be endocrine mediated also at potentially even lower levels. And the ethoxylates were identified as SVHC as they degrade to the octyl phenol and the nonyl phenol in the environment. So thanks very much for listening.